Beyond the blinding stage lights, BTS hides a deeply emotional reality rarely seen in headlines. What happens when global superstars step off camera to face life's cruelest battles? Could a secret gesture become a literal lifeline for someone fighting cancer? We are exposing 7 tear-jerking moments these boys became real-life angels. Who secretly paid massive medical bills? Who fulfilled a dying fan's final wish? Grab your tissues. Ready to see who claims the #1 spot? Let's dive right in. Number 7. RM. A leader's silent blueprint, the handwritten letter that defeated death. Let's be completely real for a second, guys. Imagine being trapped in a sterile, freezing white hospital room where the only constant companion is the rhythmic, haunting beep of a heart monitor, a relentless mechanical sound that constantly reminds you of your own fragile mortality and the terrifying ticking of the clock. Chemotherapy is not just a brutal physical battle that ravages the body, it is an agonizing, soul-crushing psychological war that strips away your identity, your hair, your energy, and your dreams, leaving you exhausted, hollow, and questioning if waking up tomorrow is even worth the agonizing pain. Now picture a fiercely bright, ambitious 16-year-old girl named Sarah, a soul whose entire sprawling universe was suddenly and cruelly confined to the 4 claustrophobic walls of a pediatric oncology ward. Her vibrant dreams of the future instantly replaced by the terrifying, anxiety-inducing uncertainty of blood counts, bone marrow biopsies, and endless radiation schedules. In the darkest, most suffocating abyss of her treatment, when her tiny body was utterly failing and her spirit was teetering on the absolute brink of shattering into a million irreparable pieces, she found a desperately needed, unexpected lifeline in the profound philosophical lyrics of Kim Namjoon, known to millions worldwide as RM, the fiercely intelligent, profoundly empathetic, and visionary leader of BTS. While RM was endlessly busy breaking impossible global records, delivering historically monumental speeches at the United Nations, and carrying the unimaginable, back-breaking weight of leading the biggest and most scrutinized musical act on the entire planet, he somehow, miraculously, found a way to reach into the quietest, most agonizing, and invisible corners of a dying fan's life. It wasn't just a generic, PR-approved message of fleeting support sent through an agency representative. It was a deeply personal, earth-shattering intervention that proved his angelic heart beats with an empathy that defies human comprehension. Sarah had been desperately clinging to RM's legendary UN speech, obsessively replaying his powerful, groundbreaking plea to speak yourself and find your own name, actively using his deep, soothing voice as an impenetrable shield against the creeping, toxic darkness of clinical depression that almost always accompanies severe, life-threatening pediatric illnesses, especially when the cold IV drips feel like liquid ice entering your veins. Her heartbroken mother, desperate beyond words to see her fading daughter smile just one last time as her medical prognosis rapidly worsened into a tragic inevitability, reached out through a complex, chaotic maze of fan communities, never in a million years expecting a miracle to actually happen in real life. But the universe works in wildly mysterious, beautiful ways, and the desperate mother's message miraculously bypassed the seemingly impenetrable corporate walls of big-hit entertainment, landing directly and heavily right into the massive, gentle hands of Namjoon himself. What happened next in the absolute dead of night is a staggering testament to the core character of a man who fiercely refuses to let his stratospheric superstar status detach him from raw, bleeding human suffering. Amidst a gruelingly exhausting, sleep-deprived world tour with absolutely no flashing cameras around, no calculating PR team orchestrating a viral publicity stunt, and zero intention of ever letting this profoundly intimate moment leak to the public press, RM took hours out of his precious resting time to handwrite a massively long, deeply reflective, and tear-soaked letter to Sarah. He deliberately chose not to write it as an untouchable celebrity talking down to a tragic fan. He wrote it completely raw, as one fragile human being to another, bravely pouring his own hidden vulnerabilities, his own secret struggles with crushing self-doubt, and his profound, unwavering belief in the terrifying resilience of the human spirit onto the thick, ink-stained paper. He didn't stop there, guys. He painstakingly curated and sent a heavily protected secret package containing a uniquely personalized playlist centered around his solo track, Everything Goes, a meticulously chosen selection of rare philosophical books that had personally dragged him through his own darkest, most depressive times, and an intimately recorded, unreleased audio message meant to gently soothe her fiercely anxious mind during the agonizing midnight hours of chemotherapy side effects. When that mysterious package finally arrived at the dreary hospital, the heavy atmosphere in the room completely and instantaneously shifted, exactly as if a brilliant, blinding ray of golden sunlight had suddenly violently pierced through a suffocating, apocalyptic storm cloud. Sarah held that handwritten letter like it was a sacred, glowing artifact, her heavily tear-stained, sunken eyes frantically scanning the beautiful Korean script written by her ultimate idol, absorbing words that completely validated her immense physical pain, but furiously, stubbornly challenged her to keep breathing, keep fighting, and keep defying the medical odds. Namjoon wrote poetically about the vast concept of the night sky, explaining in beautiful detail how the most brilliant, breathtaking stars can only truly be seen and appreciated when the surrounding world plunges into absolute, terrifying darkness, and how her current, agonizing battle with cancer was just the dark, necessary canvas preparing the universe to showcase her incredible, undeniable light to the world. He promised her, with a sincerity that bled through the page, that her invisible pain was not actually invisible to him, that he was actively carrying her story in his heart every single time he stepped onto a roaring stadium stage, and that she was a crucial, irreplaceable part of the massive, beautiful galaxy they had built together with ARMY. Can you even begin to comprehend the monumental psychological and physiological impact of such a staggeringly beautiful gesture on a dying, hopeless child? The astounded medical staff officially noted an inexplicable, miraculous, and immediate shift in Sarah's entire physical demeanor. Her dangerously erratic heart rate suddenly stabilized, her long-lost will to eat miraculously returned, and the paralyzing, suffocating fear of death that had aggressively gripped her for endless months was powerfully replaced by a fierce, undeniable, burning determination to survive, to beat the cancer, and to live long enough to look Namjoon in the eyes at a live concert. This wasn't just a fleeting, brief moment of superficial happiness. It was a fundamental, biological rewiring of her deepest survival instincts, powerfully catalyzed by the genuine, bleeding empathy of a global superstar who actively took a moment out of his chaotic, life-or-death existence to definitely say, "I see you, you matter, and you are not allowed to give up." The sheer, unfathomable depth of Namjoon's compassion in this hidden moment is absolutely staggering, completely and permanently obliterating the cynical, toxic narrative that mega celebrities only care about their financial bottom line and global chart rankings. He didn't just passively send a check, he sent a literal piece of his own soul, a highly customized, impenetrable emotional anchor that violently dragged this young girl back from the terrifying edge of the absolute abyss. Think deeply about the immense mental bandwidth and emotional fortitude required to actively absorb the heavy, traumatic reality of a young fan's terminal illness, while simultaneously managing the crushing, suffocating expectations of millions of fans worldwide. Yet Namjoon handled this impossible duality with the grace, profound wisdom, and deep gentleness of a true modern-day philosopher king. His written words literally became her most potent medicine, his deep voice her safest sanctuary, and his highly guarded secret gesture a definitive, undeniable proof that the power of music and genuine, unfiltered human connection can sometimes miraculously achieve what the most advanced modern medicine alone simply cannot. Number 6. Jin, the worldwide savior's secret check. A mother's desperate cry answered. Let's strip away the glamorous red carpets, the deafening stadium cheers, and the dazzling designer outfits for a moment and focus on the gritty, devastating reality of a family completely suffocated by the unbearable weight of a childhood cancer diagnosis. Imagine the soul-crushing agony of Leo's parents, a hard-working, blue-collar couple who suddenly found themselves thrust into a living nightmare when their bright, energetic 7-year-old boy was diagnosed with an aggressive, late-stage form of acute lymphoblastic leukemia. It is one thing to helplessly watch your precious child wither away from the toxic, ravaging effects of relentless chemotherapy, losing his hair, his infectious laughter, and his boundless energy, but it is an entirely different, uniquely horrific kind of hell when you simultaneously receive a stack of astronomical hospital bills that practically guarantee your family will be completely destitute and utterly homeless by the end of the year. The financial toxicity of cancer is a silent, vicious predator that brutally destroys families long before the disease itself takes its final toll, forcing desperate mothers and fathers to make impossible, agonizing choices between paying for life-saving experimental treatments or keeping the heat and electricity running in their tiny, cramped apartment. Leo, despite being trapped in a sterile, frightening pediatric intensive care unit, found his only source of pure, unadulterated joy in the bright, comforting, and wildly entertaining videos of Kim Seok-jin, widely known as Jin, the eldest, famously humorous, and undeniably charismatic, worldwide handsome vocalist of BTS. To Leo, Jin wasn't just a distant, untouchable pop star. He was a hilarious, comforting, virtual big brother whose infectious windshield wiper laugh and unapologetic confidence provided a crucial, desperately needed escape from the terrifying reality of spinal taps, bone marrow biopsies, and the constant, suffocating fear of the unknown. As Leo's medical condition rapidly deteriorated, requiring a specialized, staggeringly expensive stem cell transplant that his parents' insurance absolutely refused to cover, his devastated mother, completely out of options and running purely on fumes of desperate hope, created a heartbreaking crowdfunding campaign, pleading with the universe for a miracle that seemed mathematically and practically impossible to achieve. This is the exact, breathtaking moment where the universe perfectly aligned and the famously private, immensely generous heart of Kim Seok-jin quietly stepped out of the glittering shadows of global superstardom to completely rewrite the tragic ending of this agonizing family story. While the public furiously debated chart positions and analyzed music videos, Jin, who has a long, fiercely guarded history of making massive, anonymous donations to children's charities and secretly joining elite philanthropic honor societies without ever breathing a word to the press, was quietly reviewing reports from a pediatric medical foundation he privately supported out of his own pocket. When his deeply empathetic eyes landed on Leo's tragically familiar profile, seeing a brave little boy tightly clutching a BT-21RJ plushie in a hospital bed surrounded by terrifying medical machinery, something profound and immovable shifted within the superstar's heart. Jin, a man who has always used his bright, outgoing persona to shield his deeply sensitive and profoundly caring nature, absolutely refused to let financial ruin be the reason a fiercely loyal fan lost his life, recognizing that true influence is utterly meaningless if it cannot be weaponized to protect the most vulnerable and defenseless among us. Without consulting his PR team, without organizing a flashy press conference, and explicitly demanding absolute, ironclad anonymity from the hospital administration, Jin personally authorized a staggering, life-changing financial transfer that completely wiped out Leo's suffocating medical debt in a single earth-shattering instant, fully covering the exorbitant cost of the specialized stem cell transplant and ensuring the family's basic living expenses were completely taken care of for the entire duration of the grueling recovery process. Try to genuinely fathom the sheer, unfathomable shock and the overwhelming, collapsing relief that washed over Leo's desperate parents when the hospital's financial counselor, with tears welling in her own eyes, quietly informed them that a mysterious, anonymous guardian angel had completely cleared their impossible balance, effectively giving their dying son a highly improbable, deeply miraculous second chance at life. The crushing, suffocating boulder of financial ruin was instantly, violently shattered, allowing the family to entirely redirect their severely depleted physical and emotional energy toward the only thing that actually mattered: loving, supporting, and fiercely fighting alongside their little boy as he bravely faced the most critical, harrowing medical procedure of his young life. But Jin's profound angelic intervention didn't just abruptly stop at a massive, faceless financial transaction. Understanding the immense psychological toll of the impending transplant, he carefully arranged for a highly secretive, heavily sanitized package to be delivered directly to Leo's isolation room on the terrifying morning of the surgery. Inside was not just generic artist merchandise, but a beautifully curated collection of Jin's favorite calming teas, a massive, incredibly soft custom blanket designed to keep the freezing hospital chills away, and most importantly, a highly personal, deeply touching handwritten note filled with his signature dad jokes, immensely comforting words of brotherly encouragement, and a powerful, solemn promise that RJ and all of BTS were standing directly behind him, silently lending him their strength for the massive battle ahead. When Leo woke up from the agonizing, deeply painful procedure, his tiny, frail body completely exhausted but miraculously stable, the very first thing he saw was that beautiful, comforting letter from his ultimate hero, instantly sparking a weak, incredibly beautiful smile that the medical staff hadn't seen in months, proving that the immense healing power of genuine joy and profound emotional connection is just as critical to recovery as the medicine flowing through his veins. Jin's deliberate, fiercely protected choice to remain completely invisible throughout this entire staggering ordeal, actively avoiding the immense global praise and viral headlines that would have inevitably followed such a massive, heroic gesture, speaks devastating volumes about his true, unfiltered character, perfectly illustrating a rare, deeply honorable purity of intention that is almost entirely extinct in today's highly calculated, clout-chasing celebrity culture. He didn't want to be aggressively worshipped as a flashy savior. He simply, desperately wanted a little boy to live, laugh, and grow up, proving that behind his famously flawless face and quick-witted humor lies a fiercely protective, immensely compassionate soul that silently operates as a powerful, invisible shield for those who have absolutely no one else to fight for them. Leo's miraculously successful recovery and triumphant discharge from the pediatric oncology ward stands as a breathtaking, undeniable testament to the life-saving, world-altering impact of a single, deeply compassionate act of staggering generosity, forcing us all to deeply question how we can use our own limited resources to actively alleviate the silent, agonizing suffering happening right in our own communities. How many other impossible, crushing medical debts has Seok Jin secretly erased in the dead of night? How many other desperate, crying families have unexpectedly woken up to discover that their darkest, most terrifying nightmare was instantly ended by a worldwide superstar who simply refuses to turn a blind eye to human suffering? The sheer magnitude of this hidden, completely selfless miracle is absolutely enough to shatter even the most cynical hearts, definitively cementing Seokjig's legacy not just as a global music icon, but as a literal, life-saving superhero who quietly walks among us, actively changing the world one massive, silent act of pure, unadulterated love at a time, leaving an indelible, magnificent mark on humanity that no chart record could ever possibly outshine. Number 5. Suga. The stoic rapper's secret melody, a broken dream rebuilt, a lifeline delivered in silence. When you look at Min Yoongi, globally celebrated as the fierce, untouchable rapper Suga and the genius producer August D, you instantly see a man who commands the massive stadium stages with an intimidating, fiery presence, a sharply guarded, stoic exterior that seemingly deflects any and all superficial emotionality with absolute, effortless cool. But beneath that heavily armored, profoundly quiet demeanor lies a fiercely empathetic, wildly bleeding heart that understands the agonizing depths of human suffering and shattered dreams more intimately than anyone could possibly fathom. Imagine the utterly suffocating pitch-black despair of a 15-year-old brilliant musical prodigy named Maya, a girl whose entire vibrant, promising existence revolved around the complex, beautiful classical melodies she effortlessly produced on her beloved grand piano, until a devastating, completely unexpected diagnosis of aggressive pediatric bone cancer violently derailed her entire life. As if the sheer body-ravaging torture of high-dose chemotherapy and endless agonizing surgeries wasn't already a horrific enough hell for a young, fragile child to endure, the incredibly toxic side effects of the life-saving medication triggered severe, irreversible peripheral neuropathy in her once agile hands, permanently stripping away her physical ability to press down on the heavy, demanding ivory keys. For Maya, losing her music wasn't just a tragic medical side effect, it was the brutal, unceremonious assassination of her very soul, plunging her into a catatonic, terrifying clinical depression where she completely stopped speaking, entirely gave up on her grueling physical therapy routines, and began silently, tragically waiting for the aggressive cancer to finally claim her broken spirit. Enter Yoongi, a deeply reflective man who intimately, viscerally knows the absolute terror of having a lifelong musical dream almost completely destroyed by sudden physical trauma, intimately recalling the agonizing, hopeless days following his horrific pre-debut motorcycle accident that violently shattered his shoulder and left him crying alone in the dark, absolutely terrified he would never be able to perform, produce, or debut again. Through his highly secretive, heavily guarded annual philanthropic donations to a localized pediatric cancer foundation, massive, life-changing financial donations he notoriously makes under the strict, non-negotiable condition of absolute anonymity, Yoongi was quietly made aware of Maya's devastating situation by a deeply concerned pediatric social worker who knew the young girl intensely idolized his incredible, grueling journey from an impoverished, starving underground rapper to a global chart-topping phenomenon. What this famously quiet, heavily introverted superstar did next completely defies the stereotypical bounds of basic celebrity charity and delves straight into the deeply sacred realm of profound, tear-jerking human salvation. Completely bypassing the shiny, superficial PR channels of his massive agency, Yoongi locked himself inside his legendary, heavily restricted Genius Lab and painstakingly, meticulously engineered a highly customized, ultra-sensitive digital MIDI keyboard explicitly modified to require absolutely zero physical pressure, specifically calibrated for severe nerve damage, ensuring that even the absolute faintest, weakest touch from Maya's trembling, battered fingers would instantly produce a perfectly resonant, crystal-clear musical note. But the staggering depth of Yoongi's profound intervention did not just abruptly end with a piece of highly expensive, heavily modified hardware. He deliberately packed the massive, securely crated instrument with a highly encrypted, heavily protected personalized hard drive containing an entire expansive library of absolutely unreleased, deeply emotional instrumental beats he had personally produced during his own darkest, most depressive mental health struggles. Alongside this invaluable, absolutely priceless musical treasure chest was a lengthy, heavily tear-stained, deeply raw handwritten letter from August D himself, completely stripping away his untouchable global celebrity persona to speak to her directly as a fellow scarred, bleeding artist. In this profoundly moving, intensely private letter, Yoongi explicitly and fiercely validated her immense, suffocating anger at the unfair universe, telling her that it was perfectly okay to scream, to cry, and to curse the agonizing unfairness of her failing body, but he sternly, stubbornly refused to let her believe for a single second that her musical genius was confined exclusively to her physical hands. He wrote with a shattering poetic intensity that true world-changing music is actually born in the bleeding scars of the mind and the absolute darkest, most terrifying shadows of the human soul, aggressively challenging her to use his provided beats to write out her pain, promising her that as long as she had a beating pulse and a voice, she was still a profoundly powerful musician capable of moving the world. When that massive, heavily reinforced shipping crate was finally carefully wheeled into Maya's sterile, depressingly quiet hospital room, the sheer, unfathomable shock of realizing that the legendary Min Yoongi had personally custom-built a physical lifeline specifically for her, completely and violently shattered the thick, suffocating wall of depression she had desperately built around herself. As her weak, trembling, bruised fingers gently brushed against the hypersensitive keys and a beautiful, rich, echoing chord instantly reverberated through the gloomy oncology ward, Maya broke down into agonizing, massive, earth-shattering sobs, completely releasing months of toxic trauma and absolute despair in a torrential, beautiful flood of healing tears. For the first time in what felt like an agonizing eternity, this dying, hopeless girl wasn't just staring blankly at the terrifyingly cold hospital ceiling. She was actively, fiercely producing music again, violently pouring her immense physical pain, her lingering fear of death, and her tiny, fragile glimmers of hope directly into the unreleased melancholy beats actively provided by her ultimate hero. That astounded, deeply moved medical staff officially documented a completely miraculous, inexplicable turning point in her clinical trajectory. The profound psychological empowerment and the massive, explosive return of her lost creative identity triggered a literal biological resilience within her failing body, violently boosting her dangerously low immune system and giving her the aggressive, unrelenting mental fortitude strictly required to endure the final, most brutal and toxic rounds of her agonizing chemotherapy treatment. Yoongi's completely hidden, fiercely protective act of compassion forcibly and undeniably proves that behind his sharp tongue and icy, cool exterior beats the incredibly warm heart of a man who profoundly understands that true art is about aggressively reaching into the deepest, darkest abysses of human suffering and forcefully pulling someone back into the light of the living. He didn't just passively give a sick fan a simple, fleeting moment of superficial happiness. He literally returned her stolen soul, completely rebuilding her shattered identity and aggressively proving that physical limitations can never truly silence a fiercely burning artistic passion. How many other broken, utterly destroyed dreams has this quiet, intensely observant genius secretly rebuilt in the absolute dead of night while the rest of the world was completely oblivious, obsessing over streaming numbers and chart positions? How many other desperate, crying artists have been silently saved from the agonizing brink of completely giving up because Min Yoongi actively recognized their immense pain as his own and quietly extended a hidden, deeply protective hand? This breathtaking, immensely powerful moment violently strips away all the glamorous, superficial illusions of pop superstardom to reveal the raw, unadulterated, staggering humanity of a man who deliberately uses his immense global influence not as a shiny, ego-boosting crown, but as a heavy, impenetrable shield for those who have been brutally crushed by life's cruelest, most unforgiving circumstances. Number 4. J-Hope, The Sunshine's Secret Choreography, a wheelchair-bound dream revived. When the entire globe passionately thinks of Jung Ho-sok, universally adored by millions as J-Hope, they immediately and instinctively envision an absolute powerhouse of boundless electric energy, a ridiculously charismatic dance prodigy whose legendary million-watt smile can literally light up the darkest, most massive stadium arenas in a matter of mere milliseconds. But what actually happens when that brilliant, blinding ray of human sunshine is suddenly and cruelly forced to confront a pitch-black, suffocating tragedy that threatens to permanently extinguish the vibrant light of a young, heavily inspired, aspiring dancer? Let's talk about the absolutely devastating, soul-crushing reality of Ethan, a fiercely passionate 14-year-old boy whose entire vibrant, beautiful universe revolved entirely around the pulsing, heavy beats of hip-hop and the intricate, gravity-defying street dance choreography popularized by his ultimate, untouchable idol, J-Hope. Ethan wasn't just a casual, everyday fan. He was a brilliantly talented, wildly ambitious local dance champion who had eagerly spent thousands of grueling, sweaty hours in his cramped bedroom perfectly mastering Ho-sok's notoriously difficult, legendary boy meets evil routine, innocently dreaming of one day sharing a massive global stage with his hero. But the universe can be unimaginably cruel and terrifyingly random, and Ethan's incredibly bright, exceptionally promising future was violently, brutally shattered in an instant when a highly aggressive, rapidly growing malignant tumor was discovered aggressively wrapping itself around his fragile spinal cord. The emergency, life-saving spinal surgery was an absolute agonizing medical necessity simply to keep his failing heart beating, but the devastating, completely irreversible cost was tragically astronomical. Ethan woke up in that freezing, sterile, and terrifying pediatric intensive care unit completely and permanently paralyzed from the waist down, his once strong, highly agile legs entirely unresponsive, locking him in a terrifying, claustrophobic physical prison that abruptly and violently murdered his lifelong dream of professional dancing. The resulting psychological devastation was catastrophic, heavy, and deeply suffocating. Ethan completely stopped speaking to his terrified parents, violently refused to listen to any form of music, and aggressively demanded his heartbroken mother throw away all of his beloved worn-out dance shoes, rapidly sinking into a pitch-black, absolutely hopeless clinical depression, because to a true dancer, losing the physical ability to move to the beat is essentially equivalent to losing the absolute core of your human soul. Now this is exactly where the intensely guarded, profoundly empathetic reality of J-Hope's angelic character fiercely shattered the conventional, superficial boundaries of standard celebrity charity, powerfully proving that true, world-altering hope is not just a catchy stage name, but a fiercely powerful, highly active verb. Through a completely random, deeply miraculous twist of fate involving one of the Big Hit Entertainment's backup dancers who just happened to closely know Ethan's local dance instructor, the utterly heartbreaking, deeply tragic story of the paralyzed young prodigy secretly reached Hoseok's ears precisely during the most insanely chaotic, violently busy peak of a massive, exhausting global stadium tour. While almost any other heavily exhausted, severely sleep-deprived megastar would have simply and lazily ordered their sprawling PR team to send a generic, beautifully signed merchandise package or a basic, automated get-well-soon tweet to save time, Hoseok, visibly shaken and profoundly moved to his absolute core by the young boy's completely shattered dreams, fiercely refused to take the easy, emotionally detached route. In the absolute dead of night, secretly locked inside a heavily soundproofed dance studio in a foreign hotel, operating on barely 2 grueling hours of sleep, J-Hope did something so incredibly staggering, deeply emotional, and profoundly personal that it fundamentally redefines the true meaning of raw artistic empathy. He didn't just passively tell Ethan to stay strong from behind a screen. Hoseok deliberately, painstakingly choreographed an entirely new, incredibly complex and intensely powerful hip-hop dance routine, specifically, meticulously engineered to be executed entirely using only the upper body, intricately focusing on aggressive popping, locking, and incredibly fluid arm waves that could be brilliantly performed while sitting completely stationary in a heavy, restrictive hospital wheelchair. But Hoseok's profoundly angelic, deeply tear-jerking intervention didn't abruptly end with just a simple private dance video. He secretly and aggressively contacted one of the most elite, staggeringly expensive neuro-rehabilitation facilities in the world and anonymously, massively funded a comprehensive, multi-year advanced robotic physical therapy program specifically in Ethan's name, actively ensuring the paralyzed boy would instantly have unlimited access to the absolute highest tier of experimental medical care without his struggling, severely debt-ridden family ever having to pay a single solitary dime for his agonizing recovery. Hoseok then carefully and quietly packaged the highly encrypted, deeply personal choreography video on a custom-engraved USB drive, deliberately placing it alongside a heavily tear-stained, fiercely passionate handwritten letter and a highly customized, heavily embroidered sparkling stage jacket that perfectly matched his own iconic, highly coveted concert wardrobe. When that mysterious, heavily protected package finally arrived at the gloomy, depressingly quiet oncology ward, the sheer, unfathomable magnitude of the secret gesture violently struck Ethan like a massive, blinding lightning bolt of pure, unadulterated human love. Opening that beautifully handwritten letter, Ethan's sunken, deeply tired, and hollow eyes widened in absolute paralyzing shock as he read Hoseok's fiercely protective, highly encouraging words, reading an aggressive, beautiful reminder that true, world-changing dance does not merely originate in the fragile bones of the human legs, but rather violently and beautifully explodes from the resilient, entirely indestructible rhythm of a passionate, beating heart. Hoseok explicitly and strictly challenged him, with the tough but deeply loving tone of a senior dance mentor, to urgently learn this exclusive, highly secret choreography, aggressively promising Ethan that as long as he could move his arms and physically feel the heavy bass vibrating in his chest, he was still a profoundly powerful, highly respected dancer in J-Hope's eyes. As Ethan nervously, hesitantly played the secret video, watching the absolute biggest pop star on the entire planet fiercely executing a brilliant upper-body-only routine dedicated entirely to him, something fundamentally miraculous, deeply biological, and universally profound shifted in the paralyzed boy's entirely broken spirit. The heavy, suffocating boulder of clinical depression violently shattered into a million invisible pieces. For the very first time in what felt like an agonizing, pitch-black eternity, Ethan aggressively pushed his heavy wheelchair perfectly in front of the hospital room mirror, put on the heavy, beautiful custom jacket secretly sent by his absolute hero, and slowly, fiercely began to mirror Hosok's incredibly fluid, highly intricate arm movements, desperately fighting through the heavy tears blurring his vision. The astounded, deeply emotional medical staff stood silently outside his glass door with heavy tears aggressively streaming down their own faces, officially and undeniably witnessing an absolute verified medical miracle as the intense, passionate physical exertion and the massive, explosive return of his deeply cherished artistic identity triggered a staggering, dramatic spike in his dangerously low serotonin levels, powerfully boosting his heavily compromised immune system and finally giving him the fierce, unrelenting mental fortitude strictly required to survive the grueling, toxic aftermath of his aggressive cancer treatments. Number 3. Jeon, the Midnight Lullaby, a comatose fan awakened by an angel. Let's completely strip away the dazzling, blinding glare of the massive stadium spotlights and forcibly plunge ourselves into the utterly terrifying, freezing silence of a pediatric intensive care unit, where the agonizingly slow, rhythmic beeping of life support monitors is the only heartbreaking proof that a severely fragile human life is still clinging to this earth. Imagine the absolute, soul-crushing nightmare of 12-year-old Chloe, an incredibly bright, fiercely talented young girl whose entire beautiful, innocent childhood was abruptly, violently stolen by the sudden, terrifying diagnosis of a highly aggressive, rapidly spreading malignant glioblastoma, a monstrous brain tumor that demanded an immediate, incredibly dangerous and invasive neurosurgical extraction just to give her a fighting chance at survival. The agonizingly long, highly complex surgery was technically a clinical success in physically removing the toxic mass, but the catastrophic, devastating neurological trauma left Chloe's tiny, battered body completely trapped in a profound, terrifyingly deep medical coma, heavily unresponsive to every single desperate medical intervention, leaving her completely heartbroken, severely sleep-deprived parents drowning in an ocean of absolute suffocating despair as the world-renowned neurologists quietly and tragically advised them to prepare for the absolute worst possible outcome. In that agonizing, freezing, and pitch-black abyss of utter hopelessness, Chloe's fiercely desperate mother continuously played a single solitary song on a worn-out hospital tablet right next to her daughter's motionless ear, obsessively looping the beautifully tender acoustic track Promise, Yaksak, composed and sung by Park Jimin, the mesmerizing, fiercely compassionate lead vocalist and main dancer of BTS, universally revered by millions as the group's resident angel. To Chloe, before the cruel disease brutally stole her consciousness, Jimin was never just a distant, untouchable pop star. His breathtakingly soft, deeply emotive voice was her absolute safest emotional sanctuary, a warm, impenetrable acoustic blanket that actively shielded her fiercely anxious mind from the terrifying, agonizing reality of endless blood draws, brutal chemotherapy sessions, and the suffocating, paralyzing fear of impending death. Through an incredibly miraculous, highly improbable chain of secret, frantic communications initiated by a deeply moved pediatric oncology nurse who happened to be a devoted army, the utterly devastating, deeply tragic story of the comatose young girl and her mother's desperate, unwavering reliance on his solo song miraculously bypassed the thick, heavily guarded corporate walls of big-hit entertainment, landing directly into the profoundly sensitive, fiercely empathetic heart of Jimin himself. While the rest of the oblivious, heavily distracted world furiously obsessed over trending hashtags and superficial chart analytics, Jimin, a man whose profoundly gentle soul genuinely bleeds for the suffering of others, forcefully and stubbornly refused to simply send a generic, beautifully wrapped merchandise box or a deeply detached, automated message of empty corporate sympathy. In the absolute, terrifyingly quiet dead of night, aggressively operating under the strictest, most ironclad cloak of impenetrable secrecy, to completely avoid inciting a massive, chaotic media circus, Jimin deliberately disguised himself in heavy, oversized, dark clothing and quietly slipped through the heavily secured, restricted back entrance of the towering Seoul hospital, desperately driven by an undeniable, fiercely protective instinct to physically reach the dying child who was silently, desperately clinging to his beautiful melodies. When this global, untouchable superstar silently stepped into that freezing, depressingly sterile ICU room, completely bypassing the shocked, completely paralyzed medical staff who were sworn to absolute secrecy under strict non-disclosure agreements, he didn't look like a heavily guarded billionaire pop icon. He looked exactly like a deeply concerned, heavily emotional older brother, his intensely expressive, beautiful eyes immediately welling up with heavy, hot tears at the utterly devastating, heartbreaking sight of Chloe's tiny, incredibly frail body aggressively hooked up to a terrifying, tangled maze of thick plastic life support tubes. Jimin slowly, gently pulled up a small plastic chair directly next to her terrifyingly quiet bed, carefully reaching out with his small, warm hands to tightly, fiercely hold her freezing, unresponsive fingers, entirely ignoring the chaotic, intimidating medical machinery buzzing aggressively all around them. Leaning in incredibly close to her ear, his face heavily stained with silent falling tears, Jimin did not speak through a heavily filtered microphone or a heavily produced backing track. He simply closed his eyes, took a deep, shaky breath, and began to softly, beautifully sing Promise, entirely a cappella, his breathtakingly raw, intensely emotive, and profoundly angelic vocals aggressively piercing through the suffocating, tragic silence of the terrifying hospital room. He sang with a sheer, desperate, and earth-shattering passion, specifically focusing on the deeply resonant, heavily emotional lyrics desperately urging the listener to be their own blinding light in the terrifying darkness, deliberately pouring every single ounce of his immense world-changing artistic soul, his deepest, most profound human empathy, and his fiercely protective, undeniable love directly into the heavy, tragic air, aggressively begging the universe to let his healing melody forcefully bypass her severe neurological trauma and reach her deeply hidden, trapped consciousness. And then, in a staggeringly beautiful, utterly impossible moment that completely defied every single known law of modern neurological science and left the utterly astounded, deeply weeping medical staff utterly speechless, a profound, undeniable medical miracle violently unfolded right before their very eyes. The terrifyingly flat, unmoving lines on her complex brainwave monitor suddenly, miraculously began to spike, aggressively registering a massive, explosive surge of deep cognitive recognition as Jimin's beautifully familiar heavenly high notes physically vibrated through her heavily traumatized brain. Her tiny bruised fingers, which had been completely paralyzed and entirely unresponsive for agonizing, suffocating weeks, miraculously, weakly twitched, gently squeezing back against Jimin's tightly holding hand, powerfully proving that the profound, world-altering emotional connection forged by pure, unadulterated musical empathy had aggressively and miraculously succeeded where the absolute most advanced, staggeringly expensive modern medical interventions had entirely and tragically failed. Jimin stayed in that dark, freezing room for heavily emotional hours, softly murmuring deeply encouraging, profoundly sweet words of absolute comfort, sternly but gently ordering her to wake up, to keep fighting, and to never ever let go of the beautiful promise they had just silently made to each other in the dark, before quietly slipping back into the hidden shadows of the soul night, secretly leaving behind a heavily customized, heavily funded anonymous financial trust, specifically engineered to completely cover the astronomical, crippling costs of her impending multi-year neurological rehabilitation. Number 2. V. The Secret Canvas, a Shattered Lens Restored, the masterpiece of hope. When the global masses passionately and obsessively think of Kim Tae-young, universally adored by millions simply as V, they immediately envision an absolute powerhouse of striking, otherworldly visual perfection, a deeply soulful, rumbling baritone voice that can effortlessly melt the coldest of hearts, and an incredibly eccentric, profoundly sensitive artistic genius who views the entire universe through an entirely unique, beautifully distorted creative lens. But what exactly happens when this fiercely observant, highly secretive artist, widely celebrated for his deeply emotional photography under his famous pseudonym Vante, is suddenly and violently confronted with a pitch-black, suffocating human tragedy that actively threatens to completely permanently extinguish the vibrant, burning light of a brilliantly talented young prodigy? We must forcibly plunge ourselves into the utterly devastating, completely soul-crushing reality of 17-year-old Julian, a fiercely passionate, incredibly gifted aspiring street photographer whose entire beautiful, sprawling universe was absolutely built on capturing the raw, unadulterated, fleeting moments of human emotion through the heavy glass lens of his beloved, worn-out DSLR camera. Julian was not just a casual hobbyist, he was a literal teenage visionary whose deeply moving, incredibly raw urban portraits had already begun catching the serious attention of local art galleries, innocently and fiercely dreaming of one day traveling the globe to document the beautiful, agonizing complexities of the human condition, just like his ultimate, untouchable idol, Kim Tae-young. But the universe can be staggeringly cruel and terrifyingly unpredictable, and Julian's incredibly bright, exceptionally promising artistic future was abruptly, brutally shattered into a million irreparable pieces when a highly aggressive, rapidly mutating form of advanced pediatric leukemia violently hijacked his fragile bloodstream. The ensuing agonizing medical battle was an absolute horrific nightmare. The brutally toxic, incredibly intense rounds of high-dose chemotherapy completely and entirely decimated his immune system, tragically forcing the hospital administration to lock the young artist inside a highly restricted, completely sterile, and terrifyingly claustrophobic positive pressure isolation ward for endless, agonizing months. For a fiercely visual soul like Julian, being completely trapped inside a tiny, windowless, blindingly white room where the only constant sound was the relentless, maddening hum of HEPA air filters and the terrifying beeping of his IV pumps was a fate legitimately worse than physical death. He was physically far too weak to even lift his heavy camera, completely cut off from the beautiful, chaotic outside world he desperately loved to photograph, leading to the absolute, violent assassination of his incredibly vibrant creative spirit. He rapidly sank into a terrifyingly deep, pitch-black clinical depression, completely refusing to speak, entirely refusing to eat, and simply staring blankly at the terrifyingly blank hospital wall, utterly convinced that his artistic vision was permanently dead and that his failing, bruised body would soon tragically follow. It was in this exact, desperately dark abyss of absolute hopelessness that a heavily heartbroken, deeply desperate pediatric art therapist who had helplessly watched Julian's beautiful soul aggressively wither away took a massive, wildly improbable leap of faith and secretly sent a profoundly moving, heavily detailed letter out into the chaotic digital void, desperately praying for a literal miracle. Through a staggeringly beautiful, deeply impossible cosmic alignment, that heavily tear-stained desperate plea completely bypassed the thick, impenetrable corporate machinery of big-hit entertainment, landing directly and heavily into the intensely empathetic, profoundly sensitive hands of Kim Tae-young himself. While the entirely oblivious, completely distracted world was furiously debating Fashion Week appearances and superficial brand endorsements, Tae-young, a man whose incredibly deep, heavily guarded soul genuinely bleeds for the agonizingly silent suffering of unseen artists, forcefully and stubbornly refused to simply authorize a generic, detached corporate donation or send a basic, heavily sanitized PR package. In the absolute, terrifyingly quiet dead of night, aggressively operating under the strictest, most ironclad cloak of impenetrable secrecy to completely and fiercely avoid inciting a massive, chaotic media circus that would inevitably ruin the deeply sacred intimacy of his plan, V deliberately and quietly orchestrated one of the most staggeringly beautiful, highly complex, and profoundly tear-jerking artistic interventions in modern medical history. He didn't just passively visit the hospital. Tae-young secretly brought in a highly specialized, heavily sanitized private crew to completely and miraculously hijack Julian's terrifyingly sterile isolation room, aggressively transforming the suffocating, depressing white box into a breathtaking, incredibly immersive 360-degree secret Vante art exhibition, specifically and exclusively curated for the dying boy. Because Julian was heavily suffering from severe chemo-induced neuropathy and deteriorating vision that made looking at bright digital screens incredibly agonizing, Tae-young painstakingly and deliberately printed his absolute favorite, completely unreleased personal landscape photographs on highly specialized, deeply textured, heavy-grain canvases, intentionally allowing the blind, heavily bruised boy to physically trace the beautiful, intricate lines of the mountains and oceans with his weak, trembling fingertips. But Tae-young's profoundly angelic, entirely breathtaking intervention aggressively escalated to an entirely different, staggeringly emotional echelon. He secretly installed a massive, ultra-high-definition, incredibly soft ambient projector that beautifully cast a breathtaking, slowly rotating galaxy of brilliant stars directly onto the freezing hospital ceiling, completely paired with a highly customized, heavy ambient audio track featuring the raw, unedited, deeply soothing sounds of ocean waves, rustling autumn leaves, and bustling city streets that Tae-young had personally, secretly recorded during his highly private global travels. When Tae-young finally, quietly stepped into that beautifully transformed, heavily emotional room, completely stripped of his intimidating, untouchable global superstar aura, he slowly and gently sat down beside Julian's terrifyingly quiet bed, totally ignoring the entangled tangle of life support machinery, and softly, deeply began to speak to the completely astounded, violently sobbing teenager, not as a pathetic dying fan, but as a highly esteemed, deeply respected fellow artist. In his breathtakingly deep, incredibly soothing baritone voice, Tae-young explicitly and fiercely validated Julian's immense, suffocating anger at his failing body, but aggressively, stubbornly challenged him to entirely redefine his understanding of true art, profoundly explaining that a true masterpiece is never merely captured by the glass lens of a physical camera, but is actually forged in the deep, agonizing fires of human resilience and fiercely burned directly into the soul. He gently, carefully placed Julian's old, heavy DSLR camera right back into the boy's weak, trembling hands, softly ordering him to document the terrifying, beautiful reality of his own medical battle, fiercely promising him that the absolute darkest, most terrifying shadows always produce the most striking, profoundly beautiful photographic contrast. But the staggering, completely unfathomable magnitude of Tae-young's hidden generosity violently culminated in a heavily guarded, completely anonymous financial maneuver that completely shatters the toxic illusions of celebrity greed. Under the very secretive guise of an elite international avant-garde art foundation, Tae-young aggressively and completely anonymously purchased Julian's heavily blurred, incredibly depressing and dark experimental hospital snapshots for a staggering absolute fortune, secretly channeling those massive, life-changing funds directly to the hospital's billing department, instantly and entirely obliterating the family's completely crippling, suffocating medical debt without ever taking a single ounce of public credit. The absolute earth-shattering psychological explosion of intense, pure joy, the massive return of his desperately cherished artistic ego, and the profound, undeniable realization that the biggest idol on the planet considered him a true, brilliant peer, triggered an incredibly violent, undeniable, miraculous biological shift inside Julian's failing body. Number 1. Jungkook, The Golden Angel's Final Lullaby, a dying breath caught in silence, the ultimate goodbye. We have finally arrived at the absolute pinnacle of our heartbreaking countdown, and I must urgently warn you to completely brace your fragile hearts, deeply prepare your heavily soaked tissues, and emotionally fortify your very soul, because the sheer devastating magnitude of this final, heavily guarded secret will entirely shatter whatever is left of your emotional composure. When the entire sprawling globe passionately and feverishly screams the legendary name Jungkook, they immediately and instinctively envision the untouchable, wildly powerful golden maknae of BTS, an absolute titan of the modern music industry whose breathtakingly perfect, honey-coated vocals, mesmerizing, gravity-defying choreography, and heavily tattooed, fiercely intimidating physical presence have violently conquered the highest peaks of global pop culture. But what happens when the absolute biggest, most heavily scrutinized pop star on the face of the earth is suddenly forced to confront the utterly terrifying, agonizingly irreversible reality of a human life that cannot be saved by medicine, money, or miracles, but can only be gently, beautifully guided into the pitch-black, terrifying unknown? You must forcefully plunge your deeply fragile heart into the utterly catastrophic, completely soul-crushing reality of 19-year-old Elena, a fiercely beautiful, incredibly brilliant university student whose beautifully sprawling, brightly colored dreams of the future were violently, brutally assassinated by the horrifying, sudden diagnosis of an extremely rare, rapidly mutating, and completely incurable stage 4 terminal sarcoma. Unlike the other wildly miraculous stories of triumphant medical survival we have deeply explored today, Elena's tragic, heavily heartbreaking journey had absolutely no hidden medical loopholes, no experimental life-saving therapies, and absolutely zero chance of a miraculous cinematic recovery. The horrifically aggressive cancer had completely and aggressively colonized her lungs, violently forcing her deeply traumatized, heavily weeping family to make the utterly agonizing, impossible decision to move her battered, failing body into a freezing, depressingly silent palliative hospice care facility, simply to desperately manage her excruciating, suffocating physical pain during her final, terrifyingly numbered days on Earth. In this utterly suffocating, freezing abyss of absolute, unadulterated human despair, where the heavy, terrifying shadow of impending death aggressively choked the oxygen out of the sterile hospital room, Elena's heavily bruised, frail hands desperately clutched a cheap, heavily worn-out MP3 player, obsessively and endlessly looping Jungkook's profoundly melancholic, breathtakingly beautiful solo track, Still With You, fiercely using his raw, deeply emotional, and profoundly comforting voice as an impenetrable, glowing shield against the terrifying, creeping darkness of her rapidly approaching mortality. Elena was absolutely terrified of dying, entirely paralyzed by the freezing, pitch-black fear of simply ceasing to exist, but the gentle, raining jazz melodies and Jungkook's desperate, deeply longing vocal promises actively provided her with the only fleeting, fragile moments of absolute peace she could physically grasp as her failing lungs slowly, tragically gave out. Her completely shattered, desperately heartbroken older sister, watching Elena violently gasp for air in the absolute dead of night, wrote a staggeringly desperate, violently sobbing, heavily tear-stained open letter on a highly obscure, heavily buried online oncology support forum, entirely abandoning any logical hope of it ever reaching the heavily fortified, entirely impenetrable corporate ivory towers of big-hit entertainment, simply wanting the cold, indifferent universe to know how much a distant pop star's voice meant to a dying, terrified girl. But the universe, in its wildly mysterious, breathtakingly profound, and utterly inexplicable cosmic mercy, somehow aggressively guided that deeply tragic, heavily buried digital plea completely past the sprawling armies of heavily paid PR executives, landing directly and violently into the deeply sensitive, fiercely empathetic, and heavily bleeding heart of Jungkook himself. When the youngest, wildly successful member of the biggest band in global history silently read that completely devastating, horrifyingly detailed account of Elena's impending tragic death, he completely and violently broke down, heavily sobbing in the absolute terrifyingly quiet privacy of his heavily secured apartment, fiercely struck by the deeply agonizing realization that his massive, world-dominating fame was absolutely, utterly useless against the horrific, relentless march of terminal illness. While absolutely any other heavily insulated, heavily scheduled global superstar would have simply lazily tasked their management team with sending a massive, generic floral arrangement or a heavily sanitized, beautifully edited condolence video to easily avoid the sheer, agonizing emotional trauma of directly facing death, Jungkook fiercely, stubbornly, and aggressively refused to let Elena cross over into the terrifying unknown, entirely consumed by fear. Operating completely off the grid, actively shutting off his heavily tracked mobile devices, completely bypassing his absolutely frantic, entirely oblivious personal security detail, and fiercely demanding absolute, ironclad anonymity from the deeply shocked hospice administration, Jungkook entirely disguised his heavily tattooed, wildly recognizable frame under a massive, thick black hoodie and a heavy face mask, secretly driving himself through the heavily pouring, freezing Seoul rain in the absolute pitch-black dead of night to physically reach the dying girl. When he finally silently stepped into that freezing, terrifyingly quiet hospice room, entirely stripped of his blinding, untouchable global superstar aura, leaving behind all the screaming stadiums and shattered chart records, he didn't see a pathetic dying fan. He saw a deeply terrified, intensely fragile human soul, desperately begging for a single ray of comforting light in the pitch-black dark. Jungkook slowly, gently approached her deeply monitored, terrifyingly quiet bed, entirely ignoring the intimidating buzzing tangles of morphine drips and heavy oxygen machines, and gently, carefully pulled down his heavy mask, violently shocking Elena's deeply weeping, utterly paralyzed sister into a state of absolute breathless disbelief. He didn't say a single word. He simply gently reached out his heavily tattooed, heavily scarred hands to tightly, fiercely hold Elena's incredibly cold, heavily bruised and violently trembling fingers, intimately grounding her failing body with his own immense, vibrant physical warmth.